Something big is going on in the UK at the moment, and it involves UK firearms owners, certificate holders. They are having firearms taken from them at quite an alarming rate. It's going on all over the UK at the moment. In this video, I'm going to discuss why that's happening. Hi guys, welcome back. A bit of a serious topic today. I'm going to be discussing some of the changes that have occurred in UK firearms licensing regulations and how that's affecting owners of those firearms. There is a massive gun grab going on. It's not part of an official policy of a gun grab, but it's going on nonetheless, and let's talk about what's happening there. I'm going to break it down in fairly simple terms because I know we've got a lot of international viewers. I'm going to do a video at a later date breaking down exactly the differences between, say, firearms ownership in the US versus the UK. I know a lot of people in the US probably think that we don't have any firearms here. That's not the case, but I'm not going to get into the intricacies of that. Suffice to say, we work on a licensing system, so individuals are licensed in order that they can possess and use firearms or shotguns, and they will either have a firearms certificate or a shotgun certificate, or both. And bear in mind, that is not for the purposes of self-defense like you might have in America. That is simply for the purposes of sporting or animal control. So first, we've got to touch on the regulations as they were, some of the changes that have come about and why they've come about. So an individual has to apply to possess firearms in the UK, and he does that via a licensing system, and that is conducted through their local police authority. So the individual will fill out the relevant paperwork. That would then be assessed. The police might look at things like your criminal record, your mental health, any other sort of relevant history that goes along with that, and they would assess whether you're the member of a shooting club, if you've got the right criteria to actually own the firearms in the first place, the type of firearms that you wish to own, and then you may or may not be granted a license. The same goes for shotguns. In theory, a shotgun certificate is more of a right and a firearms license is more of a privilege, but in actual fact, they're both quite hard to achieve these days. The wording in the Firearms Act refers to things like people being of good character, being honest, being law-abiding. And so the police have a look at that as well. And that extends even beyond criminal record. So good character may be things like someone with a long history of having arguments with their neighbours or the wife. If the police have been notified about those arguments, then that would obviously go against that individual and may prevent them getting a firearms license. So these kind of regulations have always been in place. And fairly recently in the UK, I think it was 2021, we had a shooting. A guy went on a shooting rampage and he gunned down, I think, 5 or 6 people, including his own mother. In fact, he got rid of his mum first, and then he went out into the streets and started gunning people down. So a bit of history with that. That guy had a series of mental health issues, and he also had a lot of posts on social media regards incels, and that he was this sort of hateful guy. He didn't like women. He had a very nihilistic attitude. He was thinking that he had been kind of disenfranchised and stuff, all the kind of red flag signs that you would commonly expect to see. And at the time, there was enough regulation existing within the Firearms Act that should have prevented him from having access to firearms. So his mother had called the police and also called various different mental health bodies that were dealing with her son, and she had warned them that she had, misgivings about him having access to firearms, given his mental state, and she thought that he should not. Those seem to have been ignored. He was also involved in 2 criminal matters, at least 2 that I could find out about. One in which he was involved in a fight with a man and a woman in the street, and the last of which he was charged because he had assaulted a 14-year-old girl in a park. Quite a serious matter. Somehow he was able to kind of get around that. There was some sort of scheme going on at the time that allowed offenders to kind of do this scheme instead of going through the normal process and going off maybe to prison or anything like that. And because he was able to take part in this scheme that was like a rehabilitation scheme, and it was a softly type approach, he actually had lost his firearms ticket when he broke the law, and then he was able to get it granted back. Now, that is pivotal that he got it granted back. They didn't have to grant it back, they chose to, and then he went on, I think, a month later to go on a shooting spree. So very, very bad indeed. Very bad for all the victims, and also, of course, all the firearms owners that are legitimate people in the UK that hate seeing these idiots, going around doing that kind of thing. So given the seriousness of that situation, the government took a closer look at what was going on, and the government's main interest was actually in the way the police were conducting themselves. And these are units within the police that specialise in civilian firearms ownership. So they are firearms licensing, basically, and they are made up of a bunch of guys called FEOs, firearms inquiry officers, whose job it is to go around and assess if people should or should not have access to firearms. And they had clearly not done a very good job in this case, and they had plenty of regulation at their fingertips that would have allowed them to prevent that guy from having access to guns. The government were very, very unhappy, and then they introduced new guidelines to the police to try and ensure that each county was applying these guidelines in an even manner. Because at the time, a bit like in the States, each state kind of might have its own legal framework and policies and stuff. In England, each county's police force will behave in a slightly different manner, possibly. Some counties were kind of making up some terms and conditions over and above what was legally required, and other counties were not. There was all kinds of things going on. Some counties had subbed out the firearms licensing to companies like G4S, and some counties it was in-house and being dealt with by the police officers themselves. So a very difficult and an unusual situation in that they were all maybe operating slightly differently to one another, and I think the government just wanted to bring that all into line. So they had a close look at what had happened, and they fairly sensibly made the choices that, there should be an assessment of someone's mental health, and there should be maybe a view into someone's kind of hateful ideas and concepts. So they brought about guidelines that regulated the police when doing a firearms licensing application or renewal, that they would get some information from someone's doctor, and they would also look at someone's social media history. On the face of it, I don't disagree with those policies. We do have a licensing system here. Whether we like that or not is by the by. That has existed for many years. I'm not going to comment on that and whether I think licensing is good or bad. But what I am going to say is if you've got a licensing system, it should be consistent, it should be robust, and it should be able to do a good job of weeding out anyone that shouldn't have access to firearms, or what's the point of having it? So they farmed some of this work out to GPs, and basically when you apply for a firearms license or you renew your firearms license, you have to approach your general practitioner, your local doctor, you fill out some paperwork, and he then signs that off and sends that back to the police to let them know if he thinks that you're a reputable character in terms of medical conditions and in terms of, mental health history, etc. And the doctor should have access to all that, anything you've had in hospital, any treatments you've had or whatever, the doctor will have access to that in your medical records. So they've addressed that part. And then obviously the onus is on the police to do some sort of delve into your history on social media to see if you're posting up any sort of terrorist type stuff or you've got some kind of hateful ideology going on. Now, both of those things are slightly odd in that doctors aren't qualified as psychiatrists, so it's going to be very, very difficult for them to make a recommendation based on someone's mental health state There's a big difference in a lot of these different mental health conditions, and doctors aren't necessarily qualified to say if someone should or shouldn't have access to firearms. So they're likely to err on the side of caution there and just say, well, any mental health condition, no, they shouldn't, even if it's completely innocuous and has nothing to do with that person being angry or suicidal or anything like that. Then you've got the social media issue where the people reviewing that probably aren't trained professionals either, and they're not psychiatrists. There's going to be differences of opinion on that from county to county. And moreover, it's going to be very hard to disseminate what someone might be saying as an ironic joke or making some humour versus what someone is actually saying in a really horrible way. So, given those new government regulations, and there are a few others, but those are the kind of really pertinent parts that affect the story going forward. The police departments have taken all that on board, and as you might expect, they've kind of taken it on board like a cookie cutter approach. Common sense seems to have been, left at the door as per usual, and they are just applying these regulations in blanket fashion. A lot of people I know now have fallen foul of this. There's firearms license holders and shotgun license holders up and down the country that are having a knock at the door, and the next thing they know, there's several police there just saying, okay, we're here to take your guns away from you and we're going to revoke your license. Now, the reasons being given for that fall sort of generally within those regulations that I've just discussed and some of the older regulations as well. But they are, really, really on some of them on dodgy ground. So these are people I know personally, and these are not just anecdotal, some guy at the pub or whatever. I know these guys, and they've told me in detail what's happened to them. So an example would be someone I know who has just had their licenses revoked and guns seized because the year before their father had died, their boss had also died that was a close friend of theirs, and on top of that they had administered CPR to someone in the street trying to save them, and that person had passed away in their arms. So they had gone to their military doctor because they were serving in the forces at the time and said, I'm having a bit of a tough time. I've had 3 people die in the space of a few months and I'm feeling pretty low. Pretty standard stuff. They were experiencing a great deal of grief. We've all been through some form of that at one time or another in our lives. I wouldn't say that defines you as being mentally ill. It's a normal human condition to feel grief. And they didn't think much more about it. They had some issues there, and then that subsided and they got on with their life and they carried on working, etc. Next thing they know, their license, I think, was coming up for renewal. They get a knock at the door and it's some police officers, we're taking your firearms away. And I've heard quite a few stories along those lines. There are also people who have lost their licenses because of medication they've been on. So they've applied for a license or they're waiting for their renewal. And part of that, of course, is the doctor's certificate process. They've then found that they've been told you won't be getting a license, or we're not renewing and we're going to take your guns off you because the doctor has flagged up that you're on medication, which we don't agree with as a license holder that you should be on. And the funny thing about that is that some of this medication is very, very dubious in that it wasn't even prescribed for mental health conditions. So one of the ones that's getting quite common now is citalopram. A lot of people have been prescribed citalopram for things like pain management. So if they've had a bad back, a chronic back pain, they might get prescribed citalopram and that's been fine, and these people are not pharmacists and doctors that are prescribed these drugs. So they have no idea what citalopram is. They just take whatever the doctor gives them, the pain goes away, and they think, great, that's been really good. Unfortunately, citalopram is a dual-purpose drug, so its main application is for people that are suffering from various different mental health issues, high anxiety, stress, stuff like that, severe depression, and the police are just looking at the name of the drug. They're not really going into anything else about that, and then they're thinking, right, that person's been prescribed that drug at X date, we're going to take their firearms off them. Now, when this happens, bear in mind that there is a route to actually getting your firearms back, maybe getting your license back, but that route involves a solicitor, going to court, loads of paperwork and expense. If you lose, you're not going to recover that money. So some people are simply relinquishing their certificate of firearms altogether. In effect, it's a gun grab, utilising these sort of regulations that are sat in the background, and the police know full well that most people are probably just going to fold and say, you know what, it's too much hassle. I put my hands up, you can take the guns and just get rid of them. I'm going to give up shooting altogether. Then they're using some of the old regulations in firearms licensing and, taking guns off people because they're saying, we don't believe you're of good character, you're not an honest person. And that can be very commonly that someone's ex-wife or ex-girlfriend has rung the police and has made some inaccurate statements about them, or that person's had an argument with their partner or ex-partner, and that's been blown out of proportion. The ex-partner has rang the police and said, that guy's threatened to kill me, when in fact all that happened was they had a disagreement and they split up, or one of them had an affair and the other one wasn't happy. And I know a few people that's happened to, where, a relationship's gone sour, and then not long after that, the police have turned up and taken their guns off them. And the reasons being that, they've made threats, although that these haven't been proven in court. So there's no burden of proof. It's literally just one person's say-so that the other one has made these threats, and that's enough for the police to remove guns. I've even heard of them removing guns if they hear that someone's had a divorce or they're going through some sort of breakup in a long-term relationship. They actually turn up at the door and just say, yeah, we would like to take your guns because we think you might be in an unstable situation at the moment. Now, what's clearly happening here is that the government have rinsed the police. They've been very unhappy with previous handling of the firearms licensing process. They've given them these new regulations, and then the police are simply administering these regulations everywhere they possibly can, because they're more scared of getting one thing wrong than they are of upsetting the majority of firearms owners. So instead of taking their time, using some common sense and going into some of the nuance and complexity that's involved here, they're simply just blanketing everyone, tarring everyone with the same brush and saying, any mental health disorder, remove. And of course, if you ask a psychiatrist, he would say, well, there's a big difference between someone who's actually schizophrenic, who I don't think should have access to firearms, and someone who was naturally going through a grieving process and was pretty upset, and that's a temporary measure, a short-term thing. Now, this actually leads us to a bit of a darker place, and something that I've been very concerned about for some time with the medical side of this is that now firearms owners are becoming frightened to approach their doctors or to approach any sort of NHS healthcare when it comes to things like neurological conditions or any kind of mental condition. So if someone is very depressed and they're a firearms owner, the likelihood of them going to a doctor now and saying to that doctor, I'm experiencing some problems, is incredibly low, because they know that that will then be recorded and that will then be passed on to the police. That will then affect their ability to get firearms. And you might think, well, so what if it affects their ability to get firearms? They can live without shooting. Bear this in mind. A lot of shooters in the UK tend to be quite elderly. It's if you go to a shooting club, you'll find it's mostly made up of people that are, say, 50 to 60 plus years old, right up to 100 years old. It's quite a popular sport with the older generation, with retired people, and that tends to be their social sort of outing for the week. A lot of them live quite solitary existences. They're stuck at home. A lot of them are widows. They get out on a Saturday or Sunday to the shooting club. They're really enjoying the social interaction. Some of those guys hardly even shoot. They turn up with a gun, they shoot a handful of rounds at a target, not particularly breaking any accuracy world records. They go there because they really, really enjoy the social aspect of it. One of the nice things about shooting clubs in the UK is because everyone's been licensed and, criminal records checked, when you go there, you find that you're meeting a bunch of professional people that are genuinely good, nice people. You know, they're not made up of a bunch of sort of ne'er-do-wells and thieves. You know, you can trust the people generally that you meet at these clubs. No one's going to steal anything off you. And it is a really good place to go and socialize. And especially if you're a vulnerable character, you know, if you're feeling down, you're lonely and you're on your own, what better place to go than a place where everyone's already been records checked and signed off by the police as being safe and trustworthy. It's a great place for those people to go. And it's a good outdoor activity for them to do. It's also an activity that doesn't penalise people for being maybe physically weaker or having a physical disability in most cases. So it doesn't matter how strong or weak you are. It doesn't matter if you're 85 years old or 18 years old. You should still be able to compete with one another in a fairly equal playing field when it comes to, say, rifle shooting, for example, because you're, you know, sitting at a bench or laying down on the floor, shooting a rifle. The rifle weight is balanced on the bench or the floor, and therefore it's also a great activity for people with disabilities. And no one seems to be thinking about that. You know, it's not just the removal of firearms from these people, it's actually the removal of their social lives, the removal of their friendship group, and possibly condemning them to sitting in their houses and just going back to a completely lonely existence again. Now, none of this is official policy. You know, there's been no announcements from police firearms licensing or from the government or anyone like that to say, in 2023, we're going to run around and grab everyone's guns off them. That hasn't happened, but it's pretty clear from every shooter that I speak to that that is what's happening. So it's somewhat of an unofficial policy going on, an unofficial gun grab. I've been experiencing some problems myself. As you may have seen, I made some videos regarding a penknife that I was bringing into the country, brought the interest of the firearms inquiry officers to me, and they were kind of taking a dim view of that, and I answered all their questions. My license is up for renewal later this month. I've no doubt that this video may even cause me some issues, that I'll have some talking to do here, because they might see this as something that they don't like. And frankly, it doesn't matter if they don't like it. I'm just here reporting what's going on. These are the facts at the moment of what's happening in the UK. I'm not here to make people feel good. I'm not, you know, the good news authority. I'm here to report on what's happening. And if someone doesn't like it, well, that's not my problem. What needs to be done is, instead of taking things personally and wondering if you like someone or not, you should be just looking at what the regulations are, what the law is, and then applying those things consistently throughout the country as part of the licensing process. But that doesn't seem to be happening, particularly at the moment. I think there's, you know, there seems to be an agenda bubbling under the surface, and there seems to be some personal likes and dislikes coming into it. I think a lot of the officers in these departments simply do not think that anyone should own a gun in the UK, and their wish would be to remove all guns from the UK and not have any sporting clubs, not have anyone, you know, controlling the pest species and things like that. So what can we do about this? Well, that's a tough question at the moment. I think all you can do as a firearms license holder, or someone who's going to apply to be a firearms license holder, is to just hold yourself, you know, accountable. Make sure you're acting in the most responsible manner you can. Avoid having arguments with people. Don't be having road rage incidents, shouting at people in the street. Be kind and courteous to your neighbours. It's almost like the kind of Chinese social scoring system, some kind of dictatorship state. And unfortunately, that's the situation we're in, is that everything you do is going to be looked at through a magnifying glass. Don't go online and post silly stuff, even if you're saying it as a joke. You know, it's probably not the time, if you're a firearms license holder, to be posting unpleasant jokes, because they could be taken the wrong way and then used against you. Be aware if you've got any medical conditions in the past, or you've taken any forms of drugs in the past that could be pertinent to this, then be honest about that from the outset, because if you lie about that, they're obviously going to find it in your medical records, and lying about it is going to just be another reason for them to take your license, because then reason one, you've taken medication that they don't agree with and, you know, signifies some sort of mental health issue. Number two, you've shown that you're dishonest because you've lied about it. So now you've given them two reasons to take your license off you. You'd be much better off saying, yes, X amount of years ago, I remember I felt a bit down. I was prescribed some drugs. I'm not 100% sure what they were, but I want you to know that that happened. Then they can check that out in your medical records, which they're going to anyway. You know, there's no hiding any of this. I had in some of my previous videos about UK knife law, people saying things like, don't answer the door, never speak to the police, you know, tell them to get lost and all this kind of stuff. Those options are not on the table if you're a firearms license holder or you're a shotgun certificate holder. That isn't going to work. If you do that, you will lose your license, because you are expected to have, you know, civil engagement with the authorities. If they come to your house, you're expected to open the door and have a civil discussion with them. You're not legally obliged to let them in, but I would say it would be pretty sensible to do so, in that they can pretty much go and get a warrant to come in and seize your firearms anyway if they have any inkling that you know, there's a suspicion that you're somehow not a good person. And that could be as simple as them saying, the guy wouldn't let us in, we know he's in the house, he has guns in the house, and the judge is going to sign them a warrant. They're going to come and kick your door through and take them anyway. So, you know, don't try and be an internet hero and do all this sort of, oh, I know the law, I'm going to tell them to get lost. It doesn't work in this case. If you're going to have a discussion with them, make sure you understand firearms law. Make sure you're not waffling and just talking at random. You know, give them pertinent answers that are clear and concise and that are not incriminating. You know, there's pretty common stuff that people could say that would incriminate them. And there are many examples, and I'm not going to go through them all here, but a pretty common one would be they say, oh, does your wife know how to get into your cabinet? You know, and you go, oh, yeah, I'll tell her where the keys are. Bad idea. You know, that's in breach of your firearms certificate, because you've just given someone who's not a certificate holder access to your firearms. It doesn't matter if it's your wife, your girlfriend, your kid, whatever. That none of that matters. The fact of the matter is you should not have given that person that information. So you should have hidden your keys somewhere sensible. And there's loads of other things like that, you know, that they're going to ask you questions that you might fall foul of. If you're not confident to do that, then I would suggest talking to a solicitor, having your solicitor present if that's what you need, and then you can have that interaction in a more sensible and guided process. There's going to be a lot of people out there that just are not good in those kind of contexts of, you know, having interviews. They feel pressured. They might say things nervously and get things wrong that normally they wouldn't get wrong. That, you know, that happens to a lot of people, that they get really, really frightened. I remember it used to happen to me at school, not so much anymore. But when I was at school, you know, the teacher used to address a class, and one class member had done something naughty. And she would sort of go around and ask each of us, you know, what were you doing? Were you the one in the toilets breaking the toilet or whatever? And I used to go bright red, and I would start stuttering, and I would make mistakes in what I was saying. And basically I looked like the guilty party, but I wasn't the guilty party. You know, I'm not particularly into damaging toilets. That's not my thing. But I'm sure that those teachers a lot of times thought that I was, just because of the way that I behaved at school. And, there are some people I've met as adults that still are like that. You know, they find it really, really hard to have discussions, especially with people in authority that are kind of giving them the third degree. You know, that can be quite a frightening experience for some people. So be polite, be civil, be the best person you can be. And that is your best route through this current situation. I haven't got an answer for, a perfect answer for you guys. Because even if you do that, you're probably still going to experience some problems. I don't know of anyone currently who hasn't experienced some kind of issue to do with firearms application or renewal. There's always something that comes up, and it could be something as innocuous as you were doing 35 miles an hour in a 30, you got a standard speeding ticket for it, that will be brought up. You will be asked questions about it, because that would fall into the bad character type of scenario. So all you can do is try and be the best person you can be, which, to be fair, is the advice I give everyone anyway, with or without a firearms certificate. We should all try and go through life being the best people we can be, trying to be less angry. There's no need for going around in an angry and stressed state. It doesn't help anyone, and least of all, it helps the person who's feeling angry and stressed. Try and drop any sort of negative emotions and just try and be helpful, pleasant and polite to everyone you meet. Leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from the Americans on this topic. Like I said, I'm going to put a video up for the Americans, just going through some of the more intricate details of the Firearms Act over here, how it differs from the stuff in America. Obviously, I work in the firearms industry, so I see a bit on both sides of the pond, and I can sort of draw some differentiation for you guys. I think it would probably be of interest, because there's some stuff that we can do and have over here that the USA guys have difficulties with, and there's a lot of stuff that they can do in the USA that obviously we have difficulty doing over here. And it might be surprising to find out that a lot of that stuff can be done over here in certain circumstances. So I think that will make an interesting video, but that's for that's going to be a bit more in depth and a bit more technical. So leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. If you're a firearms owner in the UK and you've got any comments, leave it down below. Just be careful, don't give any personal details, because that could be used against you as well. If you're going on about where you live and being too detailed, or you've got social media that links you back to your address, don't be online talking about all your guns and stuff, because that will be used against you. Try and be anonymous online. Leave some comments down below on what's been going on with you. Guys, please like and subscribe. The subscriptions, I really, really appreciate. It costs you guys nothing. We're doing really well. I'm coming up for 10,000 subscribers. I was aiming to get that in the first year that I was doing social media, which we're nearly coming up to. So I'd love to hit that 10K in the next month or so. And then my next target after that will be 50K. So if you can help me get to the first 10, I'll be forever grateful. We're not making a huge amount of money here. We're just making enough to kind of make these videos. It subsidizes, the electricity, some of the camera kit and stuff. And obviously, I then spend hours and hours trying to edit these things together and make the audio sound good and all that stuff. So everything that I can get from these videos is appreciated, and it all gets funneled back in to make you more content if I can. Guys, have a great weekend. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Goodbye now.